You're able to see that?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So again, good evening. I figure, Madam Chair, just to kind of keep things simple, we might be able to answer some of the questions with the budget as we go. So tonight we'll do a quick budget breakdown. We'll talk a little bit about ambulance receipts versus tax levy. We'll talk about force deployment. I know we have a few newer members that I've had the opportunity to meet, but I think it's always good, especially with some of the additions and changes that we've had to the department over the last couple of years, just to kind of bring the committee up to speed on where we sit right now with force deployment and how our resources are deployed amongst the community. We'll do a line item review, and then we'll talk about our CIP, and then we'll do a quick question and discussion. So. All right. So this year's budget total is $3,668,045. And how that breaks down this year is 23% of the budget, or about $1,075,000, comes from the ambulance appropriations account as a direct offset to the budget. And then the balance of $2,593,045 comes from the tax levy. So just about a quarter of our budget comes from the ambulance revenue account. So just a little historical perspective on some of the last few fiscal years. In FY18, our collections were a little over $1 million. Between fiscal 19 and 20, we were up over the $1.5 million in collections. And then as we sit to date in FY21, we're about $845,000 with still several months to go in the fiscal year. So this, as I looked at the historical data today, this is typically where we would sit. We would anticipate probably about another $300,000 in collections between now and the end of the fiscal year. However, in speaking with the president of Comstar, who is our billing company, we're actually going to anticipate a little bit of a revenue reduction this year due to COVID-19. And this is pretty standard across the state with both municipal and private ambulance services, and it's a trend that we're seeing around the country. Going back to a year ago this month when COVID caused essentially the state and local municipalities to shut down, we saw a significant reduction in call volume, especially in that first 30 to 45 days, because, quite frankly, people were, not only were they not able to leave the house because there was nowhere to go, but quite frankly, people were actually afraid to go to the emergency room. So although we were doing less ambulance call volume during that time, not surprisingly, the patients that we were transporting were very, very sick, and much sicker in some cases than we normally see for things like, take for example, chest pain. Typically when someone has chest pain, they call 911 within, the onset or at least within a few hours of having chest pain. We were responding to calls where people were having chest pain for 3 or 4 days, and they were very, very sick patients at that point in time. So just this general fear that people had of even going to an emergency room during the COVID pandemic, we saw a reduction in call volume. Even motor vehicle accidents. I mean, we essentially do motor vehicle accidents in this community, almost on a daily basis, and we went about 3 weeks without a motor vehicle accident the end of March, beginning of April. So the slowdown in those early months, things started to pick back up around summer, but the math makes sense when you look at March, April, and May, and then things started to pick back up in June. Really, that's the equivalent of the 3 months, or that translates into what I'm estimating to be a reduction of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. It's hard to put a pin on it, but just looking at the data historically, that's what we would anticipate with that reduction of call volume. But again, in the last couple of years, you know, we've jumped by over $500,000 in what our receipts normally were. So although there is a reduction, it really doesn't concern me at this point because, you know, call volume is essentially back to normal now, and we'll make that up, you know, next fiscal year. So it's not something that worries me, but, you know, just when we look at the data, I just want the committee to at least understand where that number sits. So as far as our force deployment, the department consists of 41 full-time members. You have a chief, a deputy chief, one administrative assistant. We were very, very fortunate and lucky to finally fill that second full-time fire inspector's position this year with the medical retirement of Captain Stephen Anderson. So you know, as you recall, I received permission to fill the position 3 years ago. And then when the captain went on injured on duty status, we were put in a holding pattern for many years. So this past January, we hired internally our last call firefighter, Joshua Donovan, who's a fire protection engineer. We were very, very fortunate to get Mr. Donovan into that position. To have engineering services on the fire protection level in-house is a huge asset to the community, and just within the last several months, on many of the large projects we have going, he certainly proved his worth in that position. So we're very happy to have Mr. Donovan on board. And then we have 36 full-time firefighter paramedics and EMTs. How that breaks out is you have 4 working groups of 9 members that operate from 2 stations, and our minimum shift staffing is 7. As this committee can recall and remember, since I've been chief, which will be 10 years next month, I've been advocating for the increase of our minimum staffing to go from 6 to 7. So this fiscal year, we were finally able to do that. And, you know, as the town manager and Mr. Kazanovich will tell you, you know, over the last several years, I've been advocating to move that minimum staffing from 7 to 8. You know, unfortunately, it took a decade to move it this far, and in turn, the call volumes continue to increase. Things haven't gotten slower, and we'll talk about it a little bit as far as the station breakout, but it would really be great to move that needle again and go from 7 to 8 from minimum staffing. So how that breaks out currently is each group has a captain and a lieutenant. The captain works out of headquarters, the lieutenant works out of Station 2, and there's 7 firefighters to the group, and on each group that consists of 5 paramedics and 2 basic EMTs. So out of Station 1, we have an engine of 4 firefighters when we are at 9. So, you know, typically it's a good day when we're at 9, but with, you know, paid time off with vacation, personal days, or sick days, we typically hover in the 7-8 range. Most of the time we're operating at 7, you know, statistically over the course of a year. But when we're at 9, we have 4 on the engine. If we were at 8, we'd have 3. If we were at our minimum of 7, we would have 2 on the engine. And then the headquarters ambulance is staffed with 2 paramedics. Or I'm sorry, two EMTs at the paramedic level. Station 2, we have an ambulance staffed with 2 at the paramedic level. The lieutenant staffs a shift supervisor vehicle. And if everyone is in the station, so if all 3 people are in the station, we are able to staff the West Auburn engine, which is engine 1, and we're able to roll that engine. But if we're at our minimum, or if we're out on an ambulance call, we have multiple ambulance calls going on. Unfortunately, that engine is browned out, and it's not able to get on the road. So if we were able to, again, move that needle from 7 to 8, as far as our minimum shift staffing, that would give us consistency. It would put 4 firefighters at the West Street Station. It would give us consistency to staff that engine, at least with 2 members. It's not ideal, but at least it would put the engine on the road, and it would keep that engine staffed consistent. As I believe I mentioned last year, when we were going through the housing project, the Blaker Street housing project, which is a 40B project, which will put an additional 320 housing units on Blaker Street. If you recall, when that process was going on through the Board of Selectmen, I made it known through those public hearings that the construction of 320 housing units will have a direct impact on the fire rescue department. In fact, we are the department in the community that will most likely be affected the most by the construction of these, not only with emergency call volume, which I peg estimated at this point at about 100 additional emergency calls a year, but the types of facilities and the construction of these, they're also going to require annual inspections. So that's going to be additional inspections on our code compliance unit as well. Once that project is fully up and operational, early estimates during those public presentations was that we'll bring in somewhere between $1 and $1.3 million in additional tax revenue. And I stated through that public hearing process that at that time, and I've also communicated this with the town manager and the CFO, that at that time when the buildings are fully operational, I will be seeking 4 additional firefighter positions to, again, move the minimum shift staffing from 7 to 8, put 4 firefighters operating in the West Street Station so we can consistently have the West Auburn engine up. So that's not something that will hit my budget, this year or even next year. But in the next couple of years, as we start occupying some of those buildings, that will be a request that you see in future budgets. But again, it won't be until we have that additional tax revenue on the rolls. So the budget that you have before you is essentially a level service budget. There's 2 line items that had very modest increases by a few $1,000s. But other than that, it's a level service budget. Now, when you look at the budget, it shows that it's an increase of 8.10%, but that's actually, it's really 5.8% as it relates to the tax levy. And in the next slide, we'll talk about why that is with the new position that we have in this budget. So it's really a 5.8% increase on the levy, and that 5% increase, probably about 5.1 or 5.2% of that is from contractual obligations that are owed to members. So this budget does have 1 new position in the budget, and it's called the Community Paramedic and EMS Educator. It's a critical new position that will ultimately be funded through the state's Certified Expenditure Program. And this is a program that's funded through Medicare, and essentially what the program is Medicare recognizes that ambulance services, especially municipal ambulance services, when we transport Medicare or Medicaid patients, we're doing that at a negotiated reduced rate. So that rate currently through Medicare is $400. So it doesn't matter whether we provide $1,000 worth of medications and skills and whatever we're doing in the truck, it's a flat fee of $400. So, and again, you've heard me say this, I hate to talk about ambulance calls from a dollars and cents perspective because it's not the goal and it's not why we're here. But fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, there is a dollars and cents, conversation that goes on here. But so when you're transporting a Medicare patient, from a financial perspective, you're already operating in the red when it comes from an equipment and a supply and just an operating perspective. So Medicare recognizes that, and they allow municipalities through a separate application process to basically prove, the amount of Medicare calls that you did, show all of your expenses within the community, right down from fuel to personnel to, you name it. And they translate that into reimbursement. And in speaking with the CPE manager from the state, I'm going to estimate that we're going to have next fiscal year a CPE return somewhere in the neighborhood of about $90,000. And I am being conservative on that number, but that is by design. but we're going to anticipate about a $90,000 return. So this new position is funded this year through ambulance receipts, but the plan for next year, the application process will open this year in October. We will file that application. We would expect to receive funds in June to be applied towards next fiscal year's budget. So this position would then translate from ambulance revenue over to the CPE program, which would fund this position. This position is ultimately going to be responsible for the EMS education and continuing education hours for our 40 EMTs and paramedics within the department. EMTs require 40 hours of continuing education training biannually, and our paramedics require 84 hours biannually, so essentially 42 hours a year. Just to put that into perspective, nurses are required to obtain 16 hours of continuing education every 2 years, and they don't even have to prove that to a recognized body. They have to have the continuing ed, but they only have to show that they've done it if asked in a proving it scenario. That's different for EMTs and paramedics. We not only have to do the continuing ed hours, but it has to be submitted both state and nationally, and then rectified, and then recertification cards would be issued. So there is a tremendous amount of hours, training hours, that need to be put on in the course of a year in order to keep 40 members up to snuff with what they need for Con Ed. We have 2 lieutenants right now who are doing this, I will say, on a part-time basis, because again, although they're full-time employees, they work 24-hour rotating shifts. So there's no consistency to the training and education. There's no consistency on a daily basis for Con Ed or training. Many of the programs that we're doing are handoff programs. They're being taught by multiple instructors. And quite frankly, we can and should be doing better. One of the other things that this position will assume is we've had conversations with the Board of Health. As you know, the town of Auburn contracts with a part-time public health nurse. And, typically on an annual basis in a pre-global pandemic world, it's not a bad scenario. We pay currently $10,000 for our part-time public health nurse, and again, it's not a bad deal. We saw some glaring gaps in this system during COVID, because our public health nurse that we have is not only the public health nurse for Auburn, but she's the health nurse for 18 other communities. So let's just say that she has been extremely busy over the last year, and it's not always easy to get her on the phone and to assist Auburn maybe in the way that we would need it. So in conversations with Darlene Coyle and Eileen, this community paramedic would be able to serve the role of the public health nurse. Although it's called a public health nurse, when you look at what the requirements are under the state law and what a community has to have, they need to have a person in place to do, these health functions within a community. Historically, it's fallen to a nurse. That's why it gets that title. But the reality is that it doesn't have to be a nurse that does that. The town of Foxborough is working a community paramedic program as well, and has for the last several years. And their community paramedic serves all of the functions that were previously held by a public health nurse as well, and it's working out very well. So not only will this allow better coordination internally between the health department and our agency, which, since COVID, it's been outstanding, but especially since the vaccinations, I can't say enough about the work that the Board of Health and Darlene Coyle has done over the past year. It's been outstanding, and it's been a pleasure for myself and the deputy and our staff to be able to work with them. But but I think in some respects it showed that this is going to work, that this type of setup is going to work. But more importantly, it brings this position and its duties full-time into the town. So when the Board of Health needs to call on the community paramedic to deal with some type of an issue in the community, this person is here Monday through Friday, and we don't have to track down, a part-time person. And the community paramedic will also be responsible for providing home visits to our seniors upon referral, either from our Council on Aging, Board of Health, or doctors' offices if need be. So we think that it's a very important role. If you have further questions on the position, Deputy Chief Johnson is here, and he put together a great job description in roles and responsibilities. But to say the least, this is going to be a very, very critical but a very busy position. So at this time, Madam Chair, that kind of concludes sort of the overview. So if the committee wants to just take a look at any of the general line items, that's fine. Like I said, for the most part, it's a level service budget. We saw an increase in medical supplies by $5,000, but ultimately that's ambulance receipts. We saw a slight increase in the health and wellness line item because now that we're in OSHA state, we're required to do more health and wellness testing to stay OSHA compliant. And the other increase was in the firefighter education line. Their contract, it doubled the amount of education, and it's not a lot of money. They're going from $1,000 to $2,000 for an educational stipend, but that was really the largest jump. If you were to look at the budget, it's really the only line that doubled. But again, that represents that 5-point something increase. Other than that, everything is either level funded or it's increased due to a contractual obligation.
All right, thank you, Chief. I appreciate that presentation. So members, do you have any questions? Mr. Kennedy?
I do have a few that I made note of, Madam Chair. Chief, ambulance receipts, how are we doing in terms of collections? You mentioned the company that's out there. How are we doing percentage-wise collection, in terms of collections?
Yep, let me just take a quick look here. So if we go, again, if we go back to what was on the slide, which was 18, if we look at, and collections go, they're tracked in two different categories. They're tracked by those patients that have insurance and those that don't have insurance. So if you look at the 3 fiscal years that I showed, 18, 19, and 20, our collection rate is anywhere from 93 to 96%. So it's an average of 94% for those patients with insurance. And patients without insurance, it goes anywhere from 81 to 86%. So the average would be somewhere around 83, 84%. And then when you look at even the partial year of FY21, the numbers are the same. So historically, our percentage rates have remained consistent, but on the insured, again, we're around that 94%, which is a very, very good collection rate when we look at other communities. And a community's demographic has a lot to do with that. But our percentage rate is very good in comparison.
Great, thank you. And do you want me to just kind of go through the questions I have, or do you want to?
Go ahead, yep.
Chief, the 4 positions that you're going to be seeking as Blaker Street comes into place, do you anticipate doing that all in one fiscal year, or are you going to try and spread that out over a couple years?
Well, it would be the hope that I do it in one fiscal year, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is it took us 10 years to move the needle from moving minimum shift staffing from 6 to 7. And my fear is that if we try to do this over multiple fiscal years, we're going to be in a situation where I'll finally move the needle to 8 in 2031. And, the reality is that we need to be at 8 now. We need to be at 8 today. So I'm hesitant to do it over a multi-year approach, for that reason. But secondly, in conversations with the town manager and the CFO, I don't think it's going to be a financial hardship on the community, because when the building is fully occupied, we now have, and again, these are based on the numbers that were in the presentation. The CFO could certainly, talk about whether or not those are finite. But we're estimating a $1.2, $1.3 million infusion into the tax levy when the building is fully occupied. So, to talk about, $250,000 to $300,000 to fund 4 positions out of a $1.2 or $1.3 million new infusion, I don't think is going to be a tremendous hardship on the community.
Okay, thank you. So certainly, we won't be the only one vying for that 1.3, though, depending on the age of the population there, and I'm sure the schools are going to be a good chunk of that as well. So, but understandable, seeking those additional positions. Inspection monies relative to that project, will we start to see, will your inspectors, again, that seems like that project has forever been in the works. Where are they currently?
So they're about to break ground over there. There have been crews over there. Right now, they are actually building a couple of duplexes that are going to be the lead-in road into what will ultimately be the 320 housing units, 320 units. So they're building the duplexes, or about to break ground on those duplexes, but they will break ground on those 40B projects this year. And then we anticipate that those will be fully occupied in the next 3 years. So we as the fire rescue department will not see revenue from inspections on those. There will be through DDIS. They'll have to pay a building permit. They'll have to pay some associated fees up front in whatever DDIS negotiated as a sort of as a package in the beginning. But on an annual basis, we do not charge for those inspections. Those inspections are, many of them that are required by law. Take our liquor establishments, for example. Any property in the town of Auburn that has a liquor license requires a joint inspection with building and fire by state law on an annual basis. Not only Auburn, but no community that I know of assesses those businesses for an additional inspection on something that's required by state law. To be quite honest with you, I would even be opposed to that. It's almost like an additional, it's an additional tax that, the state requires something and then we whack them with an invoice. So this 40B project would essentially be the same. The law requires that there are annual inspections there, but those are not inspections that we would invoice. Much like other inspections on, whether they're town-owned or not, but some of our other elderly, housing projects that require annuals, nobody's charged for those either.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, the community paramedic position, is that going to be a civilian paramedic? Is that going to be a firefighter paramedic? And where would I see that in terms of on the line items here?
So that is sort of that's an unknown at this point. Well, some of it is an unknown. I'm going to advertise the position internally, and if I get an internal member to apply, then the position would stay within the bargaining unit. It would be a firefighter, paramedic position. But if I have no internal interest and we have to go outside, then the deputy and I have talked, and we're going to modify that a little bit. And if we have to bring somebody in from the outside, our plan is that it will be a non-union position, and it will, and most likely won't be a firefighter position either. It would just be the community paramedic, the EMS education, as a non-union position. So some of this is still up in the air because I don't know what I have for internal interest yet. So depending on how that goes will sort of be the follow-up to those next 2 points.
Okay, and for this year, where is that additional salary listed, or is it?
For this, sorry, maybe I misunderstood your question. So for this fiscal year, that salary is in the firefighters line item.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Marshall, any questions?
I guess my only question would be, we also have a couple other development projects that we anticipate with additional housing in Auburn as well, right? I think the two school buildings that are going to be, are there additional calls that we're anticipating from those as well?
Yes. So we have the Mary D and the JB school. Those are going to be 55 units each, so it'll be a total of 110 units between the two properties. I anticipate the call volume on those properties less than the 100 calls at the 40B housing, but those are estimated to be somewhere of about 30, an additional 30 per building. So between the two buildings, we anticipate it would be an additional 60 calls. And just so you know, those numbers are not, just something that we kind of pull out of thin air. That's based on historical data within like buildings, not only in our community, but a survey sample of like buildings in communities comparable to Auburn. And even, quite frankly, if they're not comparable to Auburn, you could still have a 55 and older community in the city of Boston, and you're still going to be able to derive the same data because it's the same amount of units, it's the same age group. So when you take sample shots of those types of facilities around the Commonwealth, you're able to very closely kind of pinpoint what your estimated annual call volume will be at those properties. So I anticipate an additional 30 per building in those and 100 at the 40B.
Mm-hmm.
And are those calls reflected in our existing force deployment, or would there be additional positions needed once those are fully online as well?
Well, it's forecasted for, I think, what our force deployment is, providing we get to the 8. One of the biggest challenges that we have right now, and we ran into this situation yesterday, as a matter of fact. One of the biggest issues that we have is that engine 1 is not consistent, that it's not staffed consistently. On days where we're at 9 and we have, 2 engines and a ladder and an ambulance that's staffed, or even when both ambulances are out and we have to brown out the ladder, the ability to have 2 staffed engines, that's huge in a community like Auburn where, a third of our call volume, close to 4,000 emergency calls a year, and about a third of our call volume is considered back-to-back. So it is not uncommon for us here to have 3, 4, or 5 emergency calls going on at the same time. And the problem is that even if we're at 9, we're not able to handle that 5th call. But it gets challenging when we can't handle a 3rd call because engine 1 is browned out, where if we had the truck up, we wouldn't be relying on mutual aid as much. So I don't anticipate that there would be a need for an increase in staffing at this point based on the additional call volume, but I will also say that that is taking into consideration that those additional positions will be funded in the next 2 to 3 years, and we can move the minimum shift staffing from 7 to 8. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that one extra firefighter to be able to keep an engine up is the matter of whether or not we're able to respond to an emergency or not, and what the delay from mutual aid is.
Thank you. I guess my last question would just be, is there and this is just my own ignorance, is there a cost for mutual aid? Is that costing our community that we can't respond to calls ourselves?
No, it does not. Mutual aid under state law, when municipalities enter into mutual aid agreements, each municipality bears the cost of that response, both from a salary perspective and an injury perspective. So even if we had a member that was injured in another community, either on an ambulance call or fighting a fire, the financial implications are owned by the town of Auburn. And that's fair. Just as if an Oxford firefighter was injured here, the town of Oxford would bear the financial responsibility of that injury. So it's really a one hand washes the other situation. And, the reality is that equally, we don't do any more or less mutual aid than any other community. When at the end of the year, statistically, when it all shakes out, we're going into Oxford and they're coming here, maybe within, 10 calls or something like that, but it's definitely not disproportionately off where we went to Oxford 70 times and they only came here 30. It's a very even distribution. And again, there would be no way that any municipality would be able to function from a financial standpoint if we had to pay for mutual aid. So it's a one hand washes the other, and definitely mutual aid over the years is something that we've all come to rely on. And the reality is that none of us could do what we do without mutual aid.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coleman, any questions?
No, I have a question. The information was very detailed, so I'm good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. I have a couple of questions for you, Chief. What's going on with engine 1? Last we heard, it was going to go to Florida to get fixed, and we were using an older engine 1 until that got repaired. Is the equipment still being repaired? The vehicle?
On mute, Chief.
Sorry. The engine that went to Florida is our engine 3. That's the primary engine out of the West Street station. That is in Florida, having the repairs made. Engine 1, which is our spare piece, that is currently first out of the West Street station. And Deputy, correct me if I'm wrong, are we anticipating engine 3 to be back sometime in June?
That's correct. Engine 3 should be back sometime in June.
Great. So June, okay. My other question was about the SAFER grant. We're still participating in that grant. What year are we in on that?
I'm going to have the deputy discuss the SAFER grant.
Okay.
Currently, we're on year 2 of the SAFER grant
So,
at this time, and we are still participating in it, and we're hoping, due to COVID, there's been a lot of talk about allowing you to extend it. So if that is an opportunity for us, we would look to extend it so that we could take that burden off the town a little longer.
okay. So would that mean that, so fiscal year 21 is a year 2? So fiscal year 22 that we're looking at now, is that the year 3?
No, that would be the year 2. We're in year 1 now. We're going into year 2. Sorry.
That's okay. I just want, perfect, thank you. All right, and how many ambulances do we have right now, and how many are on the road?
Currently, we own 3 ambulances. We're in the process of purchasing another one to replace one of the frontline pieces. We maintain 2 ambulances on the road all the time at the paramedic level, and we're going to be holding on to 4 ambulances due to the fact that we do have a lot of mechanical issues with ambulances due to their constant use. And based on the DPW maintenance, they've requested that we keep an additional ambulance in spare status. So we'll have 2 in the spare status that we'll be able to use. Many times we're down to 1 ambulance due to mechanical issues, so this will help solve that.
Okay, great. So when do you think you'll get that, that new ambulance? I thought it was coming in, I thought it was going to be coming this past summer.
The new ambulance has been ordered, it's been purchased.
Oh, okay.
And it's currently on the line. There was a delay with Ford as far as getting the chassis, and now the chassis is actually at the factory, and they're currently building it as we speak. We are also hoping to have that by June as well.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yep.
If I may, I know the chief indicated in his presentation that we may see a reduction in ambulance receipts as a result of COVID. I just want to let the committee members know that we have a pretty solid balance in the ambulance receipt account. We currently have about $3.6 million. So over the years, we were able to purchase these ambulances outright without entering into a lease on those vehicles. Given the fact that we've had a healthy balance for a number of years now, and that balance continues to grow. So that's a good thing.
It is. It's a very good thing. It's a good use of the of that funding. It's a good use of that revenue. Okay. All right. I don't have any more questions. Members, well.
Yeah, you reminded me of one additional question. Kevin, go ahead.
Okay, Mike. Chief, can you just clarify? We talked a little bit about mutual aid and staffing. Obviously, with the exception of the city of Worcester, how many of our bordering neighbors are full-time fire departments, meaning they don't rely on a call force to supplement at certain days, weeks, hours of for their shifts?
So again, everybody outside the city of Worcester, Town of Oxford operates a combination department, so they have 4 full-time firefighters on duty at a time, and they actually just opened their north end station. So they have 2 firefighters in their in north and 2 firefighters out south, which has actually helped us because it's increased, or I shouldn't say increased, it's shortened the ambulance response time to Auburn because that ambulance is now coming out of the north station. But then Millbury is completely on call. The Leicester Fire Department's completely on call, but they do have, Leicester has a full-time ambulance, 1 ambulance that's staffed at the paramedic level every day.
Okay, so just to sort of make a point that our staffing issues are, it's not as easy to rely on a full-time department, being surrounded by all full-time departments to respond with engines and ambulances when many of these communities are still, in part, if not fully, relying on call firefighters to fill those mutual aid requirements for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That can be a challenge, you know, especially during the day. You know, when many of the call firefighters, you know, from Leicester or Millbury, you know, that are working, you know, they do a good job, you know, when they get here for us, but sometimes there is a delay in that aid, you know, arriving. So yes, good point.
Well, thank you. And I think sometimes when I bring up some of the communities that are still operating call fire and call ambulances, you know, in some somewhat affluent communities, the Graftons and the Sturbridges, that people are sort of shocked and think I'm giving them inaccurate information. But I don't know if people really always value the fact that we've got the full-time fire and full-time ambulance personnel in here in town to meet our needs. So, you know, it's difficult to see additional positions on the financial end, but, you know, as far as the safety and wellness of the community, it's an important thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, my one additional question would be, would we anticipate an additional maintenance or need to replace more quickly the engine station at the West Station if it was fully staffed and, I guess, able to respond to more calls?
No. When you look at our capital plan, on an annual basis, I submit not only a 5-year capital plan, but I submit a 20-year capital plan. And when you look at the way that our apparatus is replaced, we replace an engine we buy a new engine every 5 years, which allows us to keep that piece of equipment on the road for 15. We buy a new ambulance every 3 years, which means we don't have a primary ambulance that is in the frontline status for more than 6. So it's on frontline status for 6, backup status for 4. So then they're out the door every 10. You know, smaller, you know, staff vehicles. We've been keeping our staff vehicles up to 12 years. So we have a good rotation. You know, the reality is that as long as, you know, the equipment is maintained and it's fixed when things break, you know, you can get the longevity out of them. You know, I think a lot of departments in years past, Auburn included, we hung on to stuff for too long. The old rule of thumb was, you kept the fire truck for 30 years. But the reality is that the last 7, you would duct tape and bubble gum and the thing together because it really shouldn't have been on the road for 30 years. But a lot of things have changed in the fleet maintenance perspective over the years, especially as more of the vehicles have become more computerized. And our Ken Raboyne, who does a great job in our fleet maintenance division, he'll tell you the same thing, that trucks are not built the same way today that they are in the past, especially with the computerization. It's when the engines are driven by computers, it's the software that becomes out of date, and it's not necessarily an engine problem, it's the computer parts that make the engine run that becomes the issue. But again, the other things that we're seeing is the types of materials that are being used, aluminum, galvanized type stuff, and the things that, the state and that we're putting on the roadways, which is exactly why after 10 years, Engine 3s in Florida get new frame rails, because some of the chemicals that we're treating roads today, they're harmful underneath the vehicles, not only your personal vehicle, but emergency equipment as well. So it does a great job on clearing the snow and ice off the street, but there's a secondary problem, that comes to that. But the short answer to the question is, no, I don't anticipate that with an increase in call volume that we'll be, needing to replace vehicles on a quicker maintenance schedule. I think the CIP plan and the rotation that we have for our equipment, I think it's a great plan. We're very fortunate that the town has been able to stick to that plan for many years, and I don't anticipate any changes in it moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Thank you. So why don't we vote on the budget, and then we're going to look at the CIP and see if we have any questions. So we're looking at, for the fire rescue department, the bottom line requested amount, let's see, the town manager recommendation, $3,668,045. And that's an increase to, as the chief mentioned, an increase to fiscal 2021 of $3,393,347, and that's because those contractual increases were not included in that budget. They came in after the budget was presented to town meeting. Do I hear a motion to recommend?
Motion to recommend.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, all in favor. Kevin?
Yes.
Ed?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
And myself, yes. Okay, great. So I'm looking at the CIP. Does anyone have any questions for the CIP?
So, Madam Chair, sometimes looking at that, it can be a little confusing. The only new item for FY22 on our CIP is the base radio replacement. So it'd be $55,000 annually on a 5-year lease for a total of $275,000. And that base radio replacement, that's going to replace all of our infrastructure at our main repeater site on Crowell Hill, as well as the backup repeater site at the Packagug School, and we'll also put in a couple of voters, which currently the Fire Rescue Department does not have, but we're going to put a few voters around town as well. So that is our only new CIP item for 22.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question looking at this for, actually, I don't have a question on that. All right, so hearing no questions about the CIP, I think we're all set. Chief, thank you very much for coming to present your budget tonight. Thank you for the presentation.
Very welcome. Thank you. You're welcome. It was good to see you all.